So the Bible is filled with all kinds of impossible stories, right? Things that just don't happen in everyday life. Like this story about Elizabeth and Zechariah, right? You know that story, Elizabeth and Zechariah, they're old. Elizabeth is long past childbearing years. An angel appears to Zechariah while he's fulfilling his duties in the temple. He's a priest of the people of Israel. And the angel says to Zechariah, "You're going to have a son." And Zechariah is like, "Really? No way. I am old." And Elizabeth, in case you haven't looked at her lately, she's a little bit past her prime. Okay? So it's not going to happen. And of course, the way that it works out is, of course, Elizabeth does conceive, and she does have a son named John, who would be John the Baptist. And then there's another story that kind of reminds me of. A story where there's an old childless couple, and an angel visits them and says that they're going to have a son, and they're greeted with disbelief that this could possibly happen. Does this sound familiar? Have you heard this story before? Abraham and Sarah? So, impossible things happen all over the Bible, and I think these stories of children coming to childless couples, to old couples long past the time when they can normally have children, it's about the children, but it's also about the people of Israel. It's a metaphor for hope. It's a metaphor for hope even in hopeless times, when it seems like nothing could possibly happen, but God is the one who acts in precisely those places where it doesn't seem like anything would be possible. Because think about how the story goes, right? There's Abraham and Sarah, and it looks like there's no way that this line is going to continue because they're old, but then they have Isaac. They have the child of promise, and things seem to be back on track. Then Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau, and despite some little problems of sibling rivalry, things kind of get worked out, and Jacob continues the line. Jacob has 12 sons. Famine hits. They have to move out of the promised land into Egypt. Doesn't look too good, but it's really not that bad either, because one of Jacob's young boys has a really good government job. And then, as now, if you have government connections, life can be pretty comfortable. So they're doing okay in Egypt. But then, a new Egyptian administration comes into power, and they forget all of the good things that Jacob's son Joseph has done. They forget all the good work that Joseph did, and they enslave Joseph's descendants. Now here again, it looks like this is the end, right? The people that God has chosen to be blessed and to be a blessing to everyone, to give the promised land, here they are, they're enslaved in Egypt. They're making bricks out of mud and straw. There's no way that they are going to be a blessing to anybody. Right? Slaves don't get set free in the ancient world. It doesn't happen. It's impossible for these helpless people to overcome the most powerful empire of the time. Except that God hears their cry. And God sends Moses to lead them out of slavery into freedom. And after a brief detour of 40 years in the desert, they make it into the promised land again. Now it looks good. Now it looks like this is where the thing really starts to get fulfilled. People can be the people of God. They can worship God. They can be blessed and be a blessing. Except they start to forget God. And their enemies start to really conquer them. Until it gets to the point, you might remember, in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire comes in and completely destroys the northern kingdom of Israel. So 10 of the tribes of Israel just vanish off the face of the earth. And about 100 years later, the Babylonians come in and destroy Jerusalem. They burn the temple to the ground. The place where God lived is gone. And the best and the brightest of the Jewish people get taken into slavery in Babylon. Now there you go. It's done, right? There is no recovery. 10 twelfths, 5/6 of the people have disappeared. And the little remnants that's left, well, thousands of miles from home. No hope, no temple. Where's God? Except that God has another idea, right? The Persians come into power and conquer the Babylonians. And the prophet Isaiah says that Cyrus, that pagan, idol-worshipping king of Persia, is actually God's anointed. We would say God's Messiah. Cyrus, that idol-worshipping bozo, is God's Messiah. But here's what happens. Nehemiah, one of the Jews that's in Cyrus's court, goes up to Cyrus. Now Nehemiah has a job that's not exactly the best job. He is kind of like in poison prevention. He is the king's cupbearer, which means that he's the guy that brings the king his food and tastes the king's food and drink to make sure that nobody's trying to poison the king. There's a good job. I'm cruising with that one. Hey, you get to eat all the good food the king eats. As long as they don't like the king, it's pretty good. And so he has access, and he says to the king, could I lead the Jewish people back to Jerusalem, rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple? Could I do it? And Cyrus says, sure. And not only that, but I'll pick up the tab. Now that's impossible, right? Stuff like that does not happen. I mean, that's just crazy talk. Except that it did happen. And God's people came back and rebuilt the temple. It wasn't as good as it was before, but they were back. But of course, the cycle just continues, right? So other people come in and conquer the Israelites and conquer that part of the world again. The temple gets destroyed and it's desecrated again. And then the Romans come in and take over, and that's where we are when Jesus starts to come into the world. Right? It's not a good situation. The Romans are pretty brutal. There is a temple again, but people are mixed in their hopes. There are some people that are longing for something new, and there are other people who, it's never going to change. It's never going to change. The Romans have all the power. It's never going to change. And God steps into the picture in an incredible way. God steps into the picture through the birth of a peasant baby. Now that Mary hears this angel messenger of God. The angel comes to Mary and says, greetings, favored one. And Mary is a little perplexed by this greeting. She's like, I'm not really sure what this is about. And then, of course, the angel has to say what angels always say, which is, don't be afraid, right? Because we all know that angels are not, repeat, not the cute little cherubs with two sets of rosy cheeks, right? Not the cute little cherubs. They are the angel army of God. Incredibly powerful, even terrifying beings. So the angel has to say, don't be afraid. And Mary, incredibly, isn't afraid. And even when the angel says stuff that's more dangerous and crazy, you're going to bear a son. And Mary's like, there's a slight detail missing here. I'm not married, haven't been with a guy, virgin, kind of. How's that going to happen? And the angel says, basically, God has it handled. This is going to be a miracle baby. Something impossible is going to happen. An interesting way for God to act in the world. And you might say, you know, when we look at this text, and we say, things don't happen like that, right? We say, well, what's really going on here? Because we are sophisticated people. We are sophisticated 21st century scientific people. And so we know what's going on, right? We know that Luke looked back at that Isaiah prophecy that we just read today, where it says, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the virgin is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. So we're tempted to just say, you know what? Luke just saw that prophecy, made up this story, because we know that virgins don't just spontaneously produce children. Because we're way smarter than first century people, right? Except, I really don't think that first century people had no clue where babies come from, right? I think they knew what kind of activity tends to produce babies. They knew what that was. And although they might not have been as sophisticated in understanding how sperm fertilizes egg and how an embryo grows, they knew the basic idea. And so it was just as impossible for them as it is for us. And I think that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point that this story is meant to convey to us. That God does do the impossible. So that when we look out at the broken world and say, peace, that somehow in this world of terrorism and mass shootings and ISIS, that there's going to be peace, that's impossible. Well, you know what? We have a God that specializes in impossible. And I think about 3.5 years ago, there was somebody in Rayapadu, India, who was saying, you know what? We don't have a well, our water source is terrible, and we are going to lose children every year to disease, because that's just the way it is, and it's impossible for us to fix this problem, and nobody cares. And then, God spoke to some people in Vernon, Connecticut, and they went to their church and they said, you know what? We would like to make a big gift and match whatever people are willing to give toward a well. We'd like to match that gift. And then the people in their church said, you know what? That's a great idea. Why don't we do that? Why don't we come together and we'll do this. We'll get it done. And so now in Rayapadu, India, there's a well. And there's a little plaque on that well that says, a cup of cold water in Jesus' name from Trinity Lutheran Church, Vernon, Connecticut. Because when we, like Mary, just say yes when God asks, the impossible becomes possible. Thanks be to God.